What if the man who made the world laugh was once taught only silence? What if behind every punchline lived a wound, and behind every roar of laughter was a cry no one heard? Tonight, we look beyond the spotlight, beyond the fame, into the quiet ache of a man who turned pain into poetry. This is not just the story of success, it's the story of survival. The tragedy and triumph of Chris Rock. If you believe Chris Rock is one of the rarest and most fearless voices of our time, leave a gentle like, a tribute to the man who taught the world that truth can laugh, even when it hurts. Chris Rock's voice didn't start in comedy clubs or studios. It started in silence. Born on February 7, 1965, in Andrews, South Carolina, Christopher Julius Rock III came into a world already divided by color and class. His parents, Julius and Rosalie, wanted more than what the South promised. They packed up their hopes and moved north to Brooklyn, chasing that fragile dream called the American promise. But promises don't pay rent, and life in Bedford-Stuyvesant was more survival than serenity. Their home was small, their world even smaller, but it was held together by two hands, his father's and his mother's. Julius worked himself raw, driving trucks and delivering newspapers until his fingers bled ink. Rosalie, strong as iron and soft as forgiveness, taught preschool by day and worked as a social worker by night. The smell of chalk and diesel mixed in their kitchen, the scent of sacrifice. At night, under the weak glow of a trembling light bulb, Julius counted coins on the table, while Rosalie mended torn sleeves. Every clink of metal was a reminder of how little separated the family from hunger. Outside, laughter floated from richer homes like music they weren't invited to hear. Chris was the eldest of 7, the one who watched everything. He learned that work wasn't a word. It was a prayer. His parents' lives became his first lesson. That love isn't always spoken, but shown through exhaustion. Then came the bus. At 10 years old, Chris was reassigned to a school across town under a new desegregation program. It promised equality but delivered cruelty. Every morning he stepped onto a yellow bus that carried him far from home. Not just across Brooklyn, but across a line the world still hadn't learned to erase. He was one of the only black children in a sea of white faces that didn't want him there. Some days he came home with bruises. He didn't explain. He'd tie his shoes tighter each morning, as if knots could hold him together. He carried the pain in silence, not because he was brave, but because he thought that was normal. The laughter of others became a weapon. But slowly, he learned to use it back. Humor became his armor, a way to survive what words couldn't fix. It wasn't about being funny. It was about not disappearing. By 13, he had learned something most people never do, that silence can be safer than truth, but it can also kill the part of you that still dreams. So he turned silence into rhythm, timing, and truth. Every insult became a lesson. Every bruise became a beat. The Brooklyn of the 1970s was no place for innocence. The air smelled of smoke and desperation. Yet from that grayness, Chris Rock began to hear music, not in songs but in struggle. By 18, he was already old in spirit. He had seen too much, felt too little safety, and learned that laughter was the one thing that made people listen. He worked any job he could find, flipping burgers, sweeping floors, scraping together enough to buy tickets to comedy shows he was too young to enter. He'd stand outside the famous Catch a Rising Star Club, his ear pressed to the wall, listening to laughter leak into the night. He didn't know it yet, but those echoes would become his calling. "I learned to laugh before I learned to breathe," he'd later say in therapy. Comedy was my way of staying alive. And that's exactly what it was. Survival dressed as humor. From that silence, a voice was born. But voices born from pain rarely find places ready to listen. At 18, Chris had no safety net, no car, and no promises. He lived in a tiny room that wheezed with cold every winter. The radiator coughed more than it worked. He slept in his jacket, stomach empty, counting ceiling cracks instead of sheep. By day, he mopped floors in diners and delivered food to offices where laughter seemed effortless. By night, he stood under buzzing neon lights, gripping a cracked microphone, facing strangers who didn't care who he was. Some nights they laughed. Other nights, they walked out. He bombed more times than he could count. But he kept showing up. That's the part the world never sees. The nights when you fail so hard you question your purpose. And the mornings when you still get up anyway. The crowds were cruel. The pay was nothing. But the dream was everything. I used to bomb so bad, he joked years later. I thought the mic hated me. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to stay alive. Then, one night in 1986, fate walked in wearing leather and confidence. Eddie Murphy, the king of comedy himself, sat in the back of a smoky club, watching a young comic stumble through his set. Where others saw nerves, Eddie saw fire. After the show, he told Chris to come see him. That conversation changed everything. Murphy brought him onto the set of Beverly Hills Cop 2. The role was tiny. The check was small. But for Chris, it was a miracle. Someone had finally seen him. He was 21, broke and invisible to the world. But Eddie's belief gave him something priceless: permission to believe in himself. The lights of Hollywood hit him fast. But fame doesn't erase the scars of hunger. He walked through those sets like a man who still heard the sound of coins hitting the kitchen table back home. He'd made it into the room, but he never forgot what it felt like to be locked out. You don't make it in this business, he said later. You survive it. In 1990, survival took him to Saturday Night Live. Studio 8H was brutal. The air smelled of caffeine, stress, and brilliance. The countdown 3, 2, 1. Live felt like a gunshot every week. You either killed or you died. The writer's room was chaos. Coffee cups, crumpled pages, laughter that sometimes felt forced. Chris fought for every joke, every second of airtime. He was the only black cast member for much of his run, carrying both expectation and invisibility. Some sketches soared, some fell flat. But every week he learned how to make truth fit into 30 seconds of television. That pressure cooked him into precision. When SNL ended in 1993, the silence returned. The kind that hums inside your chest after applause dies. Too famous to start over. Too broke to stop. He went back to where it all began. The small clubs, the long nights, the cracked mics. The road was endless. Cheap buses, cheaper motels, and endless audiences who didn't care about his resume. He performed for 6 people one night, 60 the next, pouring his truth into every set. He didn't tell jokes anymore, he confessed. Then came 1996, and Bring the Pain. The title said it all. It wasn't just stand-up, it was resurrection. Under the stage lights, his palms slick, he took a deep breath and let everything he had ever survived explode into sound. The crowd roared like thunder meeting confession. It won him 2 Emmys and redefined what comedy could be. Pain had become his language. And for a moment, it felt like the world finally understood it. But fame, like fire, gives warmth and burns at the same time. The more the world adored him, the more he felt the cost. Because when they call you the best, sleep stops coming. You start wondering what happens when they find out you're human. By the late 90s, he was unstoppable. Bigger and blacker in 1999. Never Scared in 2004. Jokes that bit through hypocrisy and still left people laughing. He performed hundreds of shows a year, flying city to city until exhaustion became home. After every standing ovation, he'd sit alone in a dressing room, lit by buzzing fluorescent light, staring at trembling hands. He'd smile anyway, because he'd survived another night. But deep down, he knew that laughter sometimes hides loneliness. Then came The Chris Rock Show. From 1997 to 2000, the place where he used humor as a scalpel. He grilled politicians and celebrities alike, not for scandal but for honesty. Comedy wasn't his mask anymore. It was his weapon. And when Everybody Hates Chris premiered in 2005, it turned his bruises into a mirror for the world. Millions laughed. He didn't. The show made people laugh, he admitted, but it kept me awake. He'd sit alone at 3 a.m., eyes red, re-editing scenes of his own childhood, rewriting his pain frame by frame. The silence of those nights was heavier than applause. But Hollywood doesn't pause for grief. Head of State 2003 barely broke even. I Think I Love My Wife 2007 doubled its cost but left critics cold. The numbers weren't failures, but the silence afterward felt like one. Success doesn't protect you from falling. It just makes the fall louder. He could have stopped there. Rich, respected, remembered. But Chris Rock never worked for applause. He worked for truth, and truth isn't safe. Behind the roar of laughter, there were echoes that never faded. The ones that whispered of loss, love, and silence too deep to fill. Before fame, before Oscars, before Netflix, there was a father whose hands told the story first. Julius Rock wasn't a man of words. He was a man of hours long, unending, back-breaking hours. He woke before dawn every day, stepping into the cold while the world still slept. The smell of oil and rain clinging to his clothes. He drove trucks, delivered newspapers, worked until his knuckles bled, all so his children would never go hungry. He didn't say, "I love you." He proved it, one exhausted day at a time. And young Chris saw it all. The bent spine, the cracked hands, the quiet dignity. When the nights were cold, Julius wrapped his coat around his son. When the fridge was nearly empty, he made humor out of hunger, so his children wouldn't feel it. That's where Chris learned it. The sacred art of turning struggle into laughter, of taking something heavy and making it light enough to carry. He once said, "My father was my hero. He taught me that if you can stand, you can fight. If you can breathe, you can provide. But even heroes fall." In 1988, when Chris was 23, Julius went into surgery for what was supposed to be a simple ulcer. Chris didn't worry. His father had survived everything else: poverty, racism, exhaustion. But sometimes the strongest hearts fail quietly. The call came early, breaking a quiet morning. Julius Rock was gone. Chris rushed to the hospital, praying it wasn't true. But it was. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. The same hands that once carried the family, now still. For the first time in his life, Chris couldn't find words. The man who made the world laugh had no idea how to cry. That morning became a fracture that never fully healed. "When my dad died," he said later, "part of me died too. But the other part got louder." That louder part became his career, his therapy, his way to talk to the man who would never answer again. Every joke after that was, in some way, a letter home. Loss doesn't end. It just changes names. In 2006, tragedy came again. Chris's half-brother, Charles, lost his fight with alcoholism. Charles was older, private, and proud. The kind of man who carried his pain like a secret too heavy to set down. To the world, he was invisible. But to Chris, he was blood, memory, a piece of home that could never be replaced. Chris tried to help. He called, he checked in, he cracked jokes to lighten the weight. But addiction is a thief that hides in plain sight. And one day, the phone rang again. Another long pause, another silence that said everything. Charles was gone. He didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't need to. Grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just lingers in the pauses between laughter. Fame teaches you how to smile for cameras. It doesn't teach you how to grieve when the world won't stop watching. The pain reshaped his comedy. His jokes became slower, deeper, less about punchlines and more about truth. He started speaking about men who can't cry until it's too late. About how silence, not weakness, destroys us. "I've seen what happens when men don't talk about their pain," he once said. "So now, I make mine talk for me." That line wasn't comedy. It was survival. Then came another kind of heartbreak. It was 1990, and Saturday Night Live was chaos wrapped in brilliance. Among the cast was Chris Farley, wild, fearless, and full of warmth. Farley's laughter could fill a room before he even spoke. He and Chris became brothers. Different in rhythm, but the same in soul. They were part of the bad boys of SNL. Adam Sandler, Rob Schneider, David Spade, Farley, and Rock. They lived off caffeine, exhaustion, and the idea that laughter could save them from their own doubts. But Chris saw something beneath Farley's jokes. The same shadow he'd fought all his life. A man who gave everything on stage because silence scared him off stage. He could make the world laugh, Rock said later, but he couldn't make himself stop crying. In December 1997, the laughter stopped. Chris Farley was gone. 33 years old. Taken by addiction and pain the world mistook for joy. When the call came, Chris froze. The world tilted. Another brother lost. Another reminder that success doesn't save souls. Farley was the funniest man I ever knew, he whispered years later. And maybe the saddest, he began to see fame differently. He saw how the spotlight blinds you while the shadows behind it grow darker. You can't joke your way out of pain, he'd tell younger comedians. You have to face it. That wasn't advice, it was warning. And then, 10 years later, silence came again. Softer, but no less cruel. In 2008, Bernie Mac, Chris's big brother in comedy, passed away at just 50 years old. Where Farley was chaos, Bernie was calm, rooted, regal, the kind of man whose laughter felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. They'd worked together on Head of State and The Longest Yard. Off camera, Bernie was a mentor, a compass that reminded Chris to carry his pride with grace. At his funeral, Chris stood trembling. Bernie didn't just make me laugh, he said, voice breaking. He made me proud to be a black comedian. We didn't just lose a man, we lost a giant. Bernie represented something rare, dignity in a world addicted to noise. Losing him felt like losing the bridge to comedy's golden era. After that, Chris's performances changed again. He wasn't performing to impress anymore. He was performing to remember. Each pause, each laugh carried the ghosts of the men who helped him find his voice. Through all those losses, the laughter somehow stayed. Because laughter, when born from pain, doesn't die. It becomes proof that love was real. But not all pain comes from death. Some comes from life. From the slow, quiet unraveling of what you thought would last forever. In 1994, Chris met a woman who didn't belong to Hollywood's noise. Malak Compton wasn't a star. She was steady light. A public relations professional with calm in her voice and grace in her eyes. She didn't laugh because he was famous. She laughed because he was human. For a man who had lived on stage, she was silence. And that silence saved him. They married in 1996, not in spectacle but in sincerity. 2 hands, 1 promise, to build a peace neither of them had ever really known. Their home in Alpine, New Jersey, became the refuge fame never could be. Mornings filled with jazz and burnt toast. Evenings with laughter echoing down hallways. When their first daughter, Lola Simone, was born in 2002, Chris said everything changed. For the first time, he said, "I didn't want to be funny. I just wanted to be there." 2 years later, came Zara Savannah. Double the laughter, double the meaning. Sundays became sacred. Central Park walks. Stroller wheels humming on the pavement. No cameras, no crowd, no performance. Just a father learning how to be still. But even the strongest love bends under the weight of distance. Fame pulls. Success stretches. And absence, however unintentional, becomes its own kind of betrayal. Chris was touring endlessly, chasing perfection on stage while imperfection crept into his home. The same man who made millions laugh began to feel like a stranger at his own dinner table. Malak, patient and grounded, watched as his silence returned, not the kind that protected him, but the kind that built walls. Sometimes marriages don't break from shouting. They break from quiet, from the nights where nothing is said but everything is felt. And then came the admission. "I wasn't a good husband," Chris confessed years later in Tambourine. "That's nobody's fault but mine." He spoke openly about infidelity, not as scandal but as self-awareness. He said success had tricked him into believing he was invincible, that fame could replace connection, But beneath the surface was something more painful, the habit of running. Every time life got too real, he hid behind humor. Every time love asked for vulnerability, he performed instead. It wasn't the affairs that ended the marriage. It was the distance. By the time he realized what love required, love had already grown tired. In December 2014, after 19 years, they announced their separation. By 2016, the divorce was final. No headlines screamed. No battles spilled into the press. They chose grace over gossip, peace over spectacle. They shared custody of their daughters, living only a few miles apart. Chris stayed close. School pickups, recitals, quiet afternoons that required no punchlines. Being a father, he said, isn't about weekends. It's about showing up. And he did. That became his redemption. Not applause, but presence. He stopped talking about failure like it was shame. He started treating it like truth. The hardest part, he once said, is realizing your kids will grow up remembering 2 houses instead of 1. That line held the ache of every parent who's ever loved but lost. But from that heartbreak came clarity. Through therapy, he learned to listen without jokes, to speak without armor. He learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you broke something you loved, and still choose to rebuild yourself. Malak never spoke with bitterness. She poured her energy into her daughters and her nonprofit, Styleworks, helping women rebuild their lives with dignity. Their love didn't end. It transformed. Because sometimes love doesn't have to stay to remain real. It only has to leave you better. March 27th, the night the world stopped laughing. The Dolby Theater shimmered in gold, drenched in applause, the air thick with Hollywood's polished pride. Cameras flashed like lightning. On stage stood Chris Rock, confident, sharp, unshaken by the weight of millions watching. He had spent decades mastering the art of composure. And then, in a heartbeat, it all changed. He cracked a light joke, the kind he'd made 1,000 times before, a playful line about Jada Pinkett Smith. The audience chuckled. Then, suddenly, the air turned heavy. From the crowd, Will Smith rose, face cold, eyes burning with something deeper than anger. Step by step, he walked toward the stage, toward Chris, toward a moment that would be replayed forever. Before anyone could process it, his hand came down. A single slap, a sound that cut sharper than applause. Gasps filled the room. The orchestra froze. Cameras kept rolling, catching disbelief in real time. For one surreal second, the world went silent, except for that echo, that crack of violence that no one saw coming. Chris stood still. No retaliation, no curse, no collapse, just stillness. He blinked once, breathed, and said, quietly, "Wow." His voice was calm, his control unshakable. He didn't fight back. He didn't break. He simply stood. That silence, that poise, became one of the most powerful moments of modern television. Because when anger met grace, the man who had been raised in silence proved that silence can also be strength. Behind the curtain, chaos swirled. Security, confusion, outrage, apologies whispered, and cameras still rolling. But Chris said nothing. He walked off stage alone, brushing his cheek, not in pain but disbelief. The man who had faced bullies, poverty, and heartbreak didn't let the moment define him. He let it breathe. In the hours that followed, the world erupted. Screens flashed. Headlines screamed. Social media roared. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone but Chris. He stayed quiet. No interviews, no statements, no rage. His silence became louder than any headline. People mistook it for fear, but it was mastery. You don't fight fire with fire, he would later say. You wait until the smoke clears, then you rebuild. That was his way. He didn't strike back. He rose above. For his younger brother Tony Rock, the silence was unbearable. He'd seen his brother humiliated in front of the world and couldn't stand still. Tony spoke out, defended, shouted, raged. But love shouted into chaos often loses its meaning. The media turned his words into spectacle. his loyalty into headlines. Suddenly, Tony wasn't just Chris's brother, he was part of the storm. And while he tried to protect his brother, he lost a piece of peace himself. Meanwhile, Will Smith sat alone backstage, the gold Oscar statue gleaming beside him, a symbol of everything he'd worked for now buried under guilt. Minutes earlier, the crowd had cheered his name. Now the echo felt hollow. He stared at his reflection and saw not the hero, not the fresh prince, but a man undone by a single moment of rage. Later, he would call it a scar for life. Weeks passed. Months. The noise didn't fade. Commentators argued, analysts dissected, and comedians joked. But Chris kept quiet. Until he didn't. In March 2023, under Netflix's bright red banner, he walked onto a stage again. Special was called Selective Outrage. And it wasn't just stand-up, it was rebirth. He turned humiliation into humor, pain into poetry. But there was no revenge in his words, only honesty. He didn't mock. He didn't scold. He told the truth, with precision and calm. The audience roared, not because they wanted blood, but because they saw courage. The man who stood silent now stood free. It wasn't a victory lap. It was closure. He had taken control of his story, and the applause that night wasn't for jokes. It was for grace. As for Will, time did what it always does, softened the edges. He spoke of regret, of reflection, of trying to heal. He called it a painful lesson in humility. The world slowly moved on, but the scar remained, one born of anger, one born of grace. And Tony, the brother who had shouted the loudest, grew quiet again. The Rock brothers reconnected privately, choosing peace over pride. Because family doesn't vanish in the fire. It survives in the ashes. That night at the Oscars will forever be remembered. Not just for the sound that broke the silence, but for what came after. The proof that restraint can be louder than rage. But the world never saw the quieter storms, the ones that didn't happen under lights, but in kitchens and hallways, between father and son. Long before the fame, Julius Rock had taught his boy that love isn't a word. It's labor. When life hit Chris in public, that lesson returned. When he stood still under the weight of a slap, he wasn't reacting as a star. He was remembering how his father used to take hits from life and keep moving. That composure was heritage. By 2020, Chris had begun opening up about something else. His diagnosis of NVLD, nonverbal learning disorder. He joked about it with honesty. I used to think I was bad at people. Turns out, I'm neurologically bad at people. But there was truth in that laughter. A man learning himself after decades of performing for everyone else. He said therapy didn't just save him. It shaped him. You don't fix yourself once, he told an interviewer. You keep learning to listen. Through the quiet, he found peace. During the pandemic, when the world slowed, he finally stopped running. He caught COVID, mild but humbling. You think you're in control, he said. Then something invisible reminds you that you're not. He recovered stronger, quieter, more centered. Now his mornings begin differently, with meditation, walks, and gratitude. He reads, he calls his daughters, he breathes. No spotlights, no schedule, just life. His longtime home in Alpine, New Jersey, stands on 2 acres of green quiet, sunlight pouring through tall windows onto photos of family and friends who shaped him. He still owns his first Brooklyn carriage house, not for status, but for memory. It reminds me where I started, he says. Inside his garage, the contrast of his journey lines up on 4 wheels. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, a Lamborghini Gallardo, a Tesla Model S Plaid, and a simple Range Rover. The one he drives most, the Rover, when he visits his daughters. Lola Simone, now 23, is studying abroad in Paris, independent, creative, curious. Zara, 21, is in Los Angeles, pursuing humanitarian work through her mother's foundation, Styleworks. They've grown into their own people, but they carry his humor, his curiosity, and his heart. My daughters, he once said, are the only standing ovations that still matter. Divorce didn't break the family. It reshaped it. He still calls every night, still shows up for birthdays, recitals and quiet dinners where laughter replaces fame. The applause of millions means less than a smile from them. That's what growth looks like. That's what peace sounds like. In 2024, he returned to one of his greatest stories. Everybody Still Hates Chris, now animated, reimagined, and renewed. It bridged generations, blending humor and healing. Old fans called it nostalgic. Younger ones called it honest. For Chris, it was full circle. The same story told by a wiser voice. At the same time, he began developing a new film. Intimate, raw, and fearless. Those close to him say it's his most personal work since Top 5. A story about redemption and the cost of truth. Even after all the awards, all the decades, he's still searching, still refining, still curious. You don't retire from truth, he smiled once. You just find new ways to tell it. Offstage, he gives quietly to schools, to disaster relief, to women's causes, to Brooklyn programs that feed and educate. He doesn't post about it. He doesn't publicize it. If you've been lucky, he says, your next job is to make sure someone else gets lucky too. That's what legacy looks like when fame no longer drives you. These days, he finds joy in the simplest things. Cooking, calling old friends, walking through New York unnoticed. Sometimes he slips into a small comedy club unannounced, takes the mic, and talks. No cameras, no lights, just him and the truth. When it's good, he says, it feels like breathing. Looking back, his life reads like a heartbeat, pulsing with triumph, trembling with loss, steadying with grace. He is no longer the angry young comic shouting at the world. He's the man who forgave it. At 60, Chris Rock has become something rarer than famous. He's become at peace. The net worth, the awards, the history, their echoes. The real wealth is quieter. The sound of laughter that heals instead of hides. The calls from daughters who still say "Dad" like it's a prayer. The peace of knowing that everything he's survived has meaning. He's still funny, but he's also free. Maybe that's the lesson his story leaves behind. You can fall, you can fail, you can lose people, break promises, and still find grace. Because greatness isn't about never breaking, it's about rebuilding. Chris Rock's life is proof that pain, when faced with courage, becomes art. That forgiveness, whether given or hoped for, is the highest form of strength. Two men, one slap, and a silence that changed the world. One scar born of anger, another born of grace. Time will remember both, but only one taught us how to stand tall after the fall. Because the miracle of being human isn't perfection, it's endurance. It's falling, breaking, and choosing to rise again, with love, with laughter, with peace. And when the lights fade, when the crowds go home, somewhere in a quiet house in New Jersey, two voices still call out, "Dad," he answers. And somewhere between those echoes, laughter lives again. Softer now, but eternal. If Chris Rock's journey touched your heart tonight, leave a like, share this story, or drop a kind word below. Because sometimes the greatest applause isn't for the performance, it's for the life lived bravely, honestly, and forgiven.